I was being physically and mentally abused. Such a dysfunctional home. There was violence in the home. Things are never perfect. Caused me to want to just get out of the home as quick as I could. 3 months after I found out I was pregnant, my boyfriend ran away. That emptiness began to just take root in my heart. My name is Annette Pruitt, and this is my story. My story began as a 10-year-old, and I lived in a home of major dysfunction. My dad was an alcoholic, my mother was an alcoholic. There was violence in the home. But my dad was a real reputable man in the town that we lived in, and most people thought he was just wonderful. They didn't know there was another side to him. I began to watch his life as it continued to get more violent. When he was drinking, he was kind of jolly and it was fun, but then there would come a point where it would just turn, and he would turn violent and mean and say horrible things and became extremely physically violent. It was so hard, and I watched this over the next few years. They always slept in two sides of the house because they were married, but it was a name only. Their marriage was just a farce. So at the age of 10, when I go to church with a friend of mine, and I feel this love for the first time, I have never felt anything like this. I was drawn, and I became a Christian, and it changed my life. I began to go to church regularly with them while my mother and my dad stayed in bed in a drunken stupor from the night before. And it was very hard to be in a situation like that, seeing that at such a young age. Finally, at the age of probably, I think it was around 13 or 14, my mother was seeking something and found Jesus. When my mom finally started going to church and gave her life to the Lord, my dad became more angry as time went on. Every year, every Christmas, my mother would buy him a Bible for Christmas, and he would get so angry with her and yell. So Christmas time was never good for us because she continued to do it year after year, thinking that was going to bring him to the Lord. By that time, the rebellion began in my life. I didn't have anyone to help disciple me through my young years and teen years because there was really no one other than my Sunday school teacher. But at the age of 14 to 15, I became sexually active, and I was rebellious towards my father, especially because I watched the anger and the violence that he created in our home. And it caused me to want to just get out of the home as quick as I could. And so I got a boyfriend, actually met him at church, and got pregnant on purpose. And I thought, okay, we'll live happily ever after. Well, that's not the story. My story was 3 months after I found out I was pregnant, my boyfriend ran away and left me alone. I decided to keep the baby. And then I prayed and I asked God to bring me a husband. Someone, even though I was young, I wanted to be married. I wanted to live a life that I could live and live for Christ wholly. Well, a few months later, I met a man at a grocery store. He was one of the grocery clerks, and he was so hungry for God, and he pursued me, and we began to go to church together. We began to pray together. He was what I thought God was bringing into my life. 6 months later, we get married. He ends up becoming an amazing father to my daughter. But 2 weeks after we were married, something happened, and it changed my life for many, many years. And that was the physical abuse began. My mother did when she was married to my father. And I just repeated, like history repeated. It just was me rather than her. But we were going to church, and we looked like the all-American family, had another baby. But the secret was I was being physically and mentally abused. It took me 13 and a half years before I could get out of this situation. It had began to affect my children, the abuse did. I could see the effects of the abuse. And it was a pastor in Lubbock, Texas, that helped me gain the strength to be able to leave this situation. So after 13 and a half years, I was able to be out on my own. I got to the time in my life that I thought, you know, I need to do things on my own now. I lived for God, but I wanted to live for my flesh, for the world. I wanted to do things that I thought I had never been able to do because I got married at such a young age. I was 16 when I married. And so I dated a couple of guys, and it wasn't part of my story. It wasn't what was supposed to be in my future. After about 2 or 3 months of living my life on my own, not going to church, just totally putting God on a shelf, that emptiness began to just take root in my heart. And I realized I needed God. And so I finally just said, God, if you're gonna bring anyone to me, it's gonna have to be from you, not something I seek out. And so I just laid it to rest and began to pray and said, God, please bring me who you want me to have for the rest of my life. And man, it was just a few weeks later, I walked into a gym and a gentleman stopped me and said, did I see you in church last week? And something sparked there. And I thought, that's interesting. And I wonder if something's gonna come of this. And then the next week, I saw him in church. And we began a conversation because class hadn't started. And then he got up with his guitar and he walked up and he was leading worship. It was his first Sunday to lead worship in our large singles class. Well, that did it for me. I was smitten. That was when I knew, okay, I really want to get to know this guy. We ended up spending time with each other over the next few weeks, and 7 weeks later, we married. And God didn't only qualify him, he qualified me to be in the ministry and to live for him and to serve him with all of our hearts. And so we've been in the ministry together for 31 years. Jimmy became the hero to my kids. They loved Jimmy, still love Jimmy. I watched him parent them in a way that I've never seen my kids parented. They felt love, they felt comfort, they felt safe and secure with him as their stepdad and loving every minute of it. But no, things were not perfect. A few years later, my mother calling me and saying, your dad's not doing well. Called all the family in and we went to the hospital. And my dad, he shared, this makes me want to cry, but he shared that he had been watching secretly my brother-in-law's church service. And at that point, at some point there, he gave his life to Christ. What was interesting about this is every Christmas, for the last few Christmases, he wouldn't even allow my sister and her husband to come because he was angry that he left his job as an advertising executive, making lots of money to become a pastor. He never understood that. But yet he was the one who led him to Christ. And it was so beautiful. And the one thing I'll never forget that my dad did in that hospital room is he hugged me and told me he loved me. And I'd never heard those words. God is good. Things are never perfect. There's only one perfect person, and that's Jesus. The moment you come to know him, you're qualified to preach the gospel, to minister to people, to tell your story, and to tell the goodness of God. And so that's my story. I made a lot of poor choices, but you know what? They all led me to where I am today. I'm grateful, and I have hope. And my hope is that my story can bring you to where you have the same hope in Jesus as I do.